And where the art world is really kind of extraordinary is it really doesn't have any specific mandate as to who belongs and who doesn't. I've been told that I've got a really great eye, and I think that that's what generated all the activity that I was able. Anything that I was able to accomplish was fundamentally based on the ability to identify aesthetics, and I identify iconoclastic aesthetics.
Today's guest has been part of the New York art world for over 4 decades. But he's not just a dealer or curator, he's a storyteller, a documentarian, a legacy builder. Damon Brandt opened his first gallery in the 1980s in New York and founded Saltmine Projects in the early 90s and has spent his career supporting artists across mediums, from contemporary and tribal art to photography. He comes from art world lineage. His father was an OG dealer, but Damon's always carved his own path, and now he's launching a new creative series focused on telling artist stories in a fresh style format. Damon, welcome to Creative Coordinates.
Thank you.
Did I get that okay?
You get that perfectly. Who is that you were just describing? That's why I
Some
wanna
other
know.
guy that was here before you.
Exactly.
I touched on your father.
Yeah.
And kind of coming from the art world.
Indeed.
Talk about your roots.
Well, the roots are always sort of, let's start with New York City, because New York City really was the landscape in which I was born and raised here. My father came out of Brooklyn, made his name as a public relations, quite well-known public relations agent, and then dovetailed into, was a collector. And so we grew up with some pretty extraordinary people coming through the house, like Jacob Lawrence, which is now sort of regarded as one of the great African-American painters from the 20th century. My father was also kind of politically active, so he was involved with what they call social realism. Ben Shahn, usually sort of art that had a political content to it. It was an interesting moment in the 60s. He opened up, he was a collector, modest collector just because of income, with my mother, and he had a mentor named Edith Halpert, who was one of the great dealers in New York City at that point, and was handling an incredible roster of artists that had gone on to sort of be the many defining moments in terms of artistic excellence out of the American, multiple sort of aspects of the American vernacular. And he went to Edith Halpert when he wanted to stop being a public relations agent, and she said, "Don't become a contemporary art dealer under any circumstances. The artist will break your heart. You'll promote them, you'll work with them, you'll bleed for them, and then they'll leave you for another gallery." And so he took that advice to heart, and he decided to open up an African art gallery. And that was an interesting moment in the 60s because a lot of people were coming back from having worked in the Peace Corps, or they were interested, psychologists were interested in tribal art as sort of, it was difficult to go into a psychiatrist's office without seeing a mask, or, it was part of an expansive vocabulary of how to look at culture and influence of culture. And obviously, African art and tribal art had already made massive inroads into the French market and the English market because of the legacy of their colonial activity, but also because of the championship of artists like Picasso and Braque and, Modigliani and that whole cast of characters. So he opened up a gallery on Madison Avenue in the 60s. And I was just a little towhead, and I would go along with him to the gallery and wander around and hang out downstairs. So, and there was a lot of dialogue in the house about art. He and I went to college, majored in American literature, really was more focused on writing than anything. Got a job immediately at Sotheby's and was fired. Got a job at Terry Dittenfast Gallery, which was a major gallery, and got fired. Got another couple sequence of jobs, and obviously the chemistry, the feral nature of my personality wasn't necessarily, this is what I've done better with my children, was not necessarily congruent with a structured environment. And where the art world is really kind of extraordinary is it really doesn't have any specific mandate as to who belongs and who doesn't. If you've got a really good eye, and I've been told that I've got a really great eye, and I think that that's what generated all the activity that I was anything that I was able to accomplish was fundamentally based on the ability to identify aesthetics and identify iconoclastic aesthetics. And also have, which I think I have, and a lot of my associates have, a real deep knowledge of the history of art. I am not an academic, but I'm voracious sort of learner and sort of voracious acquirer of new imagery. And I think that having started so what happened was when I got fired from these jobs, and it sounds surreal, but my father had a great reputation in the city, and he um, made some calls and said, My son is going to come visit you and see if you can help him. So I went around to all the top dealers. This was all tribal art now because I really didn't have any authority in the contemporary field at this point. And I went to some of the major dealers in the city, and it was a very vibrant time because right now, there are a lot of issues of patrimony, of, uh, of, of political and justified political correctness with dealing with sacred objects from religious communities from which we are not connected. So there was at that point the dialogue was really not as jagged, and it wasn't as charged. And there was a lot of stuff going on. The laws restricting the importation of objects were minimal. The laws restricting sort of eagle feathers and all that stuff that has now become, really, I would say, changing the field as I knew it. But when I was starting, I was able to, there was a very, very vibrant dealer community dealing in this material. So I was able to put together a great group of material. What I did, I think, which was something that was intuitive and not really much of a game plan, but worked out beautifully, was that I usually, when dealers consign work to other dealers, they're trying to consign work that they haven't been able to sell. What I did, which was a challenge to them, is that I asked each dealer to put 10 objects on a table, of which I would pick 3. So it became a poker game. It became, I wonder whether he'll recognize value. And, I nailed it, which was really fun. So I was able to put together a great group of objects based on a selective I was able to curate because dealers are defined by their ability to curate. That's our language. Your ability to walk into a room and pick the best painting is where your value is. Your ability to walk into a collection and see some continuity amongst the objects and the paintings. That really is some of the most interesting aspects. And each dealer has a different eye. Each dealer has a different predilection towards whether it's because of their background or their gender or their academic proclivities, but that's how you sort of form the profile of a gallery. You also build a gallery like a baseball team. You look for blind spots, you look for weaknesses, you look for, if you don't have sculpture, if you're not dealing, and I was conscious when I finally built a gallery, started a gallery on 1984, I think. But to go back briefly, I took a tour of the United States. And I nailed, it was just incredible. I sold to Bloomington, Indiana. I sold to Toledo, Detroit Art Institute, Chicago Art Institute. I mean, I came back
on this journey across America.
Yeah.
Well, how'd you get around?
It was wild. I had assembled this group of objects. I bought locally on the Upper West Side. I grew up on the Upper West Side in New York, right across the street from the Museum of Natural History. And I remember it wasn't even that far away. There was an opera singer who was advertising a Toyota Corolla station wagon, not even a station wagon. She forgot to put in the word station wagon. And I walked over to Amsterdam Avenue, and there it was, and paid my $1,100 for it and came back and filled it with, a trunk full of art and set out across the country. And probably I drove, I would say, close to 7,000 miles. I did a full circumnavigation of the country. I came, from New York to Philadelphia to Washington. Didn't sell anything after I left Washington, and I thought I was going to be in a complete, sort of death spiral. And I was like writing my epitaph. And then I went across the Blue Hills of West Virginia, and I drove into Bloomington, Indiana, and there was an IM Pay building that had just been built by Libby Glass Money, because there's a guy named, I can't remember his name, but I remember it was an extraordinary museum run by an amazing man named Roy Sieber, Dr. Roy Sieber, who is regarded as kind of one of the Obi-Wan Kenobis of the tribal art world. And it was one of those serendipitous moments that you hope for in any business, where 6 days before I got there was their acquisition meeting. And I remember going to his house, and the director was there, and Roy Sieber was there, and I put out all my objects, and he said, I'll take that, and that. And it made, that was really one of those moments of junction. And he said, and you got to go to St. Louis because I need authentication on this pre-Columbian. So I dealt in pre-Columbian, Oceanic, African, and New World cultures. And that was really kind of how I made my bones in the art field. And I rubbed a lot of people the wrong way because I was able to sell to institutions almost immediately, which is it's a legacy you need to build up. But I think a combination of my father, who had a great reputation, and my ability to choose objects. And they weren't strategically chosen based on, I didn't identify specific collectors for these objects. But what I did was I identified quality, age, balance, patina, all of those components that are really, those are the premier components of creating value in our field.
And so when you're curating this collection of stuff and objects, to use your word, obviously there's an element of that side of the business paired with storytelling.
Yes.
And just listening to you now, obviously you're an amazing storyteller, which is passed down to the next generation of brands. What was the storytelling like of Damon in Bloomington, Indiana, all those years ago? Did you have the gift of gab and were able to bring?
I did, and I think that also probably was a product of legacy, because my father had the gift of gab, and he was a good salesman, being a public relations agent, and I'd watched the way in which he'd spoken about objects. I also think that, my story was definitely legacy-based at that point, even though it ended up that I wasn't really able to work with him. When I came back to New York and started my own thing, I wouldn't say we were competitors, but it was complicated, I would think. I think that my success in the field was complicated, and created a little bit of an interesting dynamic between father and sons. There a lot of dealers, and you'll see it on the landscape now, a lot of particularly contemporary dealers, even, dealers of ancient culture. There is a desire for a child, there is a lot of that, because the art field is so seductive a place to work. It rewards, as I said, iconoclastic behavior. It rewards a depth of field in terms of client base, in terms of the ability to transact. It's also an unregulated business, which draws a very interesting cast of characters to it. So I think that most good dealers are storytellers. I think some of the most powerful dealers are more transactionally based, it seems, but they're still storytellers, because storytellers are an essential part of how you contextualize anything.
And then ultimately, how do you uphold authenticity? Has to be a part of it as well.
Huge.
So how do you uphold authenticity in a world where I'm sure when people trust you to make a decision to purchase something?
Yeah.
How does, and then they go to the market, they talk about what they did, and I'm sure people are in their ear, no, that wasn't the right thing. I don't like it. What do you see? How do you kind of preserve authenticity over time?
Part of, you don't really, I wouldn't say preserve, I wouldn't use the word preserve.
Maintain.
I would say establish authenticity. Because, and authenticity, that's a really interesting component. And I'll dovetail for a moment. One of the reasons why I was so happy to move into the contemporary field as well is because the contemporary field and the ancient tribal culture field, the ancient tribal culture field is anonymous by definition. Very rarely do you know, you almost never know the name of an artist. You'll know a hand, but you'll know the name. And there was a great relief for my ability to leave the sort of the problems of authentication and subjectivity to the when I went to the contemporary field, and I had them both working in my gallery on Broadway, which I opened, I think, in 19. My first gallery was on Bond Street, which was, and it was a kind of a fun street. Mary Boone lived across this way. Mapplethorpe lived down the street. It was in the 80s in NoHo, which was edgy and rough and wonderful, and it was where all the artists were. And so when I opened my, and I was on Bond Street for about 3, 4 years, and I started the gallery as a works on paper gallery because that gave me access to artists that otherwise would tell me don't, anytime you talk to an artist about works on paper, you're showing them that you love process and there's an intimacy. But to go back to the authenticity question, what you do is, and it's always very controversial, but not always very controversial, but you start to move into kind of like your legal mode where you're trying to establish a group of people who will agree with you. And sometimes it's based on scientific examination. Sometimes it's based on what Malcolm Gladwell talked about as that first response, that first intuitive response, which is something that a lot of us really rely on. But then you've got to go through, you do your due diligence and you look at patina, you look at restoration. You first look at style, because what's interesting about ancient tribal culture is that as the prices became really elevated, the ability to create workshops to fake material became incredibly sophisticated. Many of them not even out of Africa or, let's say, Mexico in terms of the pre-Columbian art field, but many of them became staged in Belgium and in countries not where the objects were originated, but for example, if an archaeological site was found, I dealt with some great Nok material, NOK, came and up to, I think, probably the mid 80s. Just a handful of things had been found, but then they were building a road in Nigeria, and suddenly, and this is what happened in archaeology, and I was deeply involved in all of that. Um, at the point that it was legal, at the point that it wasn't controversial, what they did was in building a road, they suddenly found the city, and suddenly there were, you know, there were. It's really interesting from a business point of view because the first three pieces come out, and people say, "I've never seen anything like these," and they sell them for, let's say, for $150,000, and then another 20 come out, and the price point drops, but become much more discriminating about what objects are going to be that value. So what ends up happening is a market really shifts based on supply and then demand. And then what ends up happening is then it tails off. Everyone thinks it's going to be never ending, and suddenly it stops. And then workshops take the fragments from that archaeology and assemble objects that didn't exist. And the reason why they do that is because there are a number of rather sophisticated uh, methodologies to establish age. Like with terracotta, there's thermoluminescence. With wood, there's dendrochronography. With stone, there is a kind of a lichen, or there's a manganese mold that develops only on ancient objects, and then you have people with microscopes who are looking at the objects to see whether they've been carved with modern tools or ancient tools, and there's a tell based on ancient or modern tools. So under very, very close examination, you can be close to coming to really the true identity of an object, but now even those things have been manipulated. So it becomes a very complex field. So I was fortunately, for me, I had enough expertise around me that I was able to. I bet I sold a fake or two without knowing it. I was going through some transparencies of without knowing. I'm going through transparencies, and every once in a while you'll come to an old transparency because I was building an archive of the things that I'd sold for a project, and I was like, I don't really think that looks right, and it's that kind of intuitive moment. It's really like I know more and I've seen other things, and I don't really think that, even though I was pretty sure when I purchased it for a fair amount of
Yeah.
money. I mean, I remember as a kid watching my father kind of walk through the house, like, in a cold sweat, thinking that he'd made a mistake. I mean, and you do that, and you
Right.
do that, and you send it to a good client, and then word gets out. But there's not a museum, there's not a museum that I've been into that there's not an object or two that I question.
Got it.
And then there's this whole conversation amongst the dealers. So I made it my duty to be relatively seductive as a personality to people that were much more powerful and much more knowledgeable than I am. So I had access. And I would say, "What do you think?" And, they would say, "I wouldn't do that." Or, and I'd do that before I'd offer it to a major collector. But then the transition came for me, which was great, where I opened up the gallery on Bond Street, and then I opened up the gallery at 568 Broadway 4 years later. A number of sort of high-profile dealers at that point convinced me to move into. There was the same amount of activity that is going on Lower Broadway, where I live in Tribeca. Right now, it's extraordinary to watch what's happening downtown, in particular below Canal Street. It's the most critical mass of contemporary, powerful, and influential contemporary galleries that I've ever seen in a concentrated area in New York City. There's 760 contemporary galleries in New York City right now. It's an absurd amount. There's 10 that are dominant. I would say there are probably 110 or 120, of which a lot of them are sort of major players that are now on White Street, on Franklin Street, on Broadway. There was a gallery in the building that I own in Tribeca for a while named Jack Hanley, that was on Duane Street, and he didn't get a lot of traffic, which was sort of interesting. So I think that there's kind of a, like in there's a kind of a there's I would say that the ecosystem really exists, east of Hudson.
But when you think about a gallery and what you opened
Look at
up
me
on
just working
Bond,
all the demographics.
Bond or Broadway,
Yeah,
right? It's a New York audience,
yeah,
heavy New York audience. I think they appreciate the specificity. But
yeah,
opening a gallery at the time you did on Bond or
yeah,
Broadway versus a gallery of 2025,
yeah.
what are just some of the differences, knowing what you know and being around it for all these years? What's changed in the gallery
Well,
business?
I'll tell you what people have said. I mean, because there's a lot of chatter. And there's a lot of. I'm old now. I'm 68, right? So, but I hang out with a younger group of
You
people
look good.
because
You
there's a
look
lot of
cooler
old.
than
There's a
us.
lot of old chatter. It's like, this is what it was like, and this is what it should be like, and I wish it was still like that, and why isn't it like that? And no
Yeah.
one's the same, and. But one of the reasons why I got very interested in my curatorial identity, which I've curated maybe 7 or 8 shows with major galleries like Casman, David Nolan, Friedrichs and Pfizer, and I've curated them Upper East Side, Lower West Side. I mean, I've sort of almost interesting geographically try to sort of see that, and so I'm up to date in terms of, but galleries right now, I would think, I would say that the internet it's sort of the way the internet has destroyed retail. It's made it really complicated, for dealers. The community was smaller. Everyone talks about the community being smaller. My father talked about his communities being smaller. The generation before that talked about how important, but the community is the community, and there's a hierarchy in the community, and it's always going to be that way. I would think that the most difficult thing for galleries is just how many there are. And the fact that most collectors and curators are bombarded on a daily basis with, come to the exhibition. Um, I think that the metrics are still the same, where most galleries, I would say a medium-sized gallery. I never got to the level of elevation of some of the major players, but mine was more kind of, as I said, I had a group of maybe 12 to 15 artists that I represented, all of whom were able to leave their jobs while I was working with them, and I was making enough money for my artists for them to live an independent life. I think that's gotten a lot more expensive. I think that there's a lot more pressure from the artists in terms of elevation of prices quickly. I think that uh, The community, the collecting community is inundated. The museum community, I think, it feels to me is like increasingly beholden to associations with galleries to help them and with artists. Artists, I think, don't necessarily have. I think they've always, artists, some artists stay with dealers for a long time, but the amount of heartbreak, which is what I said with regard to my father, the advice he got early on is still, sort of epidemic. Um, and there is I would say that there is a kind of a low grade fever resentment of the Zverners and the Hauser and Wirths and the Paces and some of the major galleries that have had such an extraordinary ability to create. I mean, supposedly Larry, of course, the $1 billion boy. I remember I recently was watching, but New York is still a great place to be. And I think that, to quote him, he was saying the reason why he loves New York is that there's some of the wealthiest, most competitive, insecure people in the world. And that creates a market. Particularly, what's so interesting about my field is fundamentally it's really subjective. It is, subject to trend, subject to the whispering of advisors, subject it's really based on it's so subjective that I think that that's why a lot of people in the financial community love it, is because anything that is that subjective can be manipulated accordingly. Auction houses have tried to create a I would say a database that has been very useful for dealers. When ArtNet first came out, they were the first to create a database of prices, and now that is an absolutely essential tool for every dealer who is dealing in the secondary market. The art business is complex because you have primary market and secondary market. And even dealers who are dealing in their artists with their artists on a primary level then have opportunity to deal with those same artists on a secondary level, whether it's reselling something that a collector bought early on, or whether it's sort of buying something with another dealer of an artist that these. I mean, so it's a very convoluted and very kind of complex series of it's a Rubik's cube of opportunity, and potential exploitation. So it's not.
And how do you ultimately like stay
I hope I
up?
don't sound too cynical, right?
No, I think it's
Okay.
good insight and intel.
Yeah.
How do you
Because I'm
maintain?
still deeply passionate about the art. I walk into an artist studio, and I'm all theirs
Yeah.
because I have such
Do you
profound
canvas galleries?
respect. What?
Do you canvas galleries on a regular basis just to stay current and just walk in?
I go through periods. I
Okay.
mean, I go in. There was a period of time where I was more aggressive about doing that, and much more sort of now. I'm in a period where I would describe that my best gallery experiences are walking in kind of anonymously, and also I find myself drawn less to the massive fanfare of the larger galleries, and I like to go into the smaller galleries that may be struggling a little bit more. It's a little bit like it comes from the same DNA of discovery, whether it is to do with an artist or whether it's to do with a dealer. That same desire to discover something that is under recognized is a motivation for all of us. I think that one of the fields that I've become really interested in and quite active in, and started my production company focused on that under the patronage of a great dealer named Andrew Edlin, who owns the Outsider Art Fair and is one of the great sort of advocates and success stories in the outsider art field, and has a gallery which he is moving into the downtown area on Broadway in the next 6 months. And he was an early patron, allowing me to. We'd done some deals together. I love the outsider art community because the artists. Um, they feel like they're much less strategic about their careers. It feels like an outside artist, a neurodivergent artist, is not trying to do something strategically so that there's going to be an audience. You can't, I don't think, this is maybe just personal. An illustrator works for a specific client. An artist works for him or herself. That's really a fundamental difference. When you're trying to do art for an audience, for me, I'm immediately less interested. Unless there's Warhol, and there are precedents for artists that were deeply audience driven. Maurizio Catalan, for example, the Banana Boy, he understands his audience and his art is triggered by his audience. But then there's a whole cast of characters that is also just doing art because they have to. They have to manifest a world that is a reality for them. And it has nothing to do with an audience-driven world. It has to do with their own personal world and the compulsion and the necessity for them to be able to map out what they see in their mind's eye.
A slight pivot here.
Please.
You mentioned Saltmine.
That's my life in a nutshell. Pivoting.
Life of pivoting.
A life of pivoting.
Better than pity.
Better than pity. Exactly.
Saltmine Projects
Yes.
is something that you've had now for 20 plus years.
20 plus years.
I don't want to date you. How do you
Please
describe that business, just in a sentence, of what it was in its original form and what it is today?
Interesting question, and one that I ask myself as often.
You could also just land on where it is today. It's up to you.
No, I like the evolution is really, for me, that's life's work, is kind of life's work is, and what I love about the art business, the art business has been torturous for me during certain times in my life. Closing a gallery is not an easy thing. Losing an artist is a very difficult thing. The financial stress of running a staff, and most of the artists that you're selling allow you to maintain that ecosystem, and often, it's a kind of a month-to-month exercise. But the reason why I love this business is because you can follow whatever lead seems most pertinent to you at that particular moment in time. So I would say that the evolution of Saltmine Projects was really nothing when it began. It was a kind of a psychological opportunity for me to create an open-ended system when I closed my gallery. And when I closed my gallery, it was 2008, and it was during the crash. And suddenly everything went away, and I couldn't afford to keep it. And I was approached by some really wonderful and pretty high-profile collectors for money. They approached me and said, "We'll back you. You've shown incredible integrity and continuity for an extended period of time, and we love your artists, and we think you are you're an important part of this ecosystem. Not essential, but you're part of," and those good collectors understood the vagaries of the business and the ups and the downs and losing artists and, making artists. So they're collectors that are predatory, and they're collectors that are sympathetic. And that's very much the way life lays itself out. But Saltmine Projects, I love the idea. I named it because salt is essential. It's inexpensive, and it's not inexpensive, but it's absolutely essential. And it basically, it's just like, it's kind of like back in the salt mines. There's an expression of, you got to get back to it, just the basics, just get back, try to do what, try to figure out what you were doing. And so when I closed the gallery in 2008, I went into a little bit, I would say a little bit of a kind of a death, sort of personal and emotional death spiral. But we had two children, and I sort of pivoted. Talk about a pivot. I pivoted and started raising my children, and not to get all sort of corny, but basically that was the pivot I needed to do. My wife, Nancy Boaz, is a designer for the last 25 years at Ralph Lauren, and worked very, very closely with Ralph. and became head of women's shoe. Her collection, she designed collection for Ralph, and so that brought a level of, and we've been married now 34 years. So after sort of a 10, I was able to kind of pivot. There was a level of stability there that allowed me to do that. I raised my children, and in the process of raising my children, I had a fair amount of time by myself, and I started Saltmine Projects with the idea of just trying to figure out what this next chapter was going to look like. And what it looked like was, it wasn't sort of walking away from the field. And fortunately, I paid all my artists. I had great relationships with the dealers. So I didn't have to sort of reconstruct out of a scorched earth moment of a sort of a business failure. I was able to sort of quietly dovetail my way out and maintain a level of stature, so that when I felt in a position, and I continued to sell art, because clients at their best are loyal. And I had some very loyal clients that believed in me, and so, and that becomes, I think, across whatever business you're in. You asked an earlier question about what the difference is between galleries then and now. And strangely enough, I think most galleries that were at my level are sustained by a handful of 2 or 3 collectors. The relationship that one develops with a collector and a curator is a very intimate relationship. It goes way across just the language of transactional. It's about taste. It's about comfort. It's about using discretionary income in an irrational way. Purchasing art is an emotional. It's not always. I mean, there are a bunch of boys out there, and I would say mostly boys, that are like, they're trading. This is it. It's an opportunity to trade and elevate themselves against their competition, whether it's Larry against Perlman. There's a whole, for the public record, there's been
Sure.
a lot of controversy, and there's been some lawsuits, but
No, that makes a lot of sense.
Saltmine Projects at this point is a grab basket for anything that I want to do. And it's, what do I say in the website? It says Saltmine Projects is an opportunity for me to collaborate with the vibrant and diverse cultural landscape. That one of those, I wrote it long enough ago, and I can't.
Pre-chat
Yeah,
GPT.
exactly. But it's like it's an incredibly fertile field,
Sure.
and it allows me to, and also I get the random calls. I'm looking for this, or so
Got a
it's
random call to be on this show.
yes,
Right?
exactly. It's a random call to be on the
Based
show.
on Saltmine. If you
How
were
am I
just a
doing? How am I
gallery,
doing?
you're doing great. I always say this is just V1 of all these conversations.
Yes, exactly.
And ultimately, where we sit today is a creative community.
Yes.
And I was thinking, just like prepping for this discussion,
Yeah.
the days of being amongst that creative community in NoHo or Soho or downtown.
Yep.
And my view, it was there as a neighborhood, but
Yes.
not under one roof.
Yes.
Whereas you've kind of walked in this environment
Right.
to have all this creativity under one roof that isn't just art. Let's just use the
But I
word.
think that's. I mean, I think that's really what makes an environment like this so special. And I've seen environments like this. I was just in Bridgeport, and they're taking, this incredible developer's taking a factory and doing what you got. I mean, this is happening. I was in St.
The scale, though, that's really what changes the
Absolutely.
the
It's
discussion.
the ability to have that many players and that diverse. And we've been talking about curating, right? How essential curating is. I remember on my first tour of this building with one of the developers, one of the owners, he was talking about how carefully the client base and your tenant base was being curated. And that is an incredibly smart, and because you get the synergetic moment of cross-pollination. And cross-pollination is really what culture is all about, and the ability for art dealers to interface with music. I mean, it's the ability to move amongst all the different cultural,
we may get a
touchstones.
Saltmine wing set up here
Exactly.
in honor of.
So
what I didn't mention.
Whenever
this
you're ready, just send me the paper. Just send me the
the
paperwork.
Saltmine office. Yeah, I have a friend that went in a salt mine in Utah and videoed. It was pretty cool to see.
Right, exactly. Don't they also?
There's
They
like
use salt
tours
mines
of,
to keep, like, like nuclear. I mean, it's just, it's all, you know, they
It's
store
deep
water. I mean,
underground.
it's
That
deep.
much
It's
that I
bunker. It's
recall.
bunker time, which is maybe sort of something that I was
So,
also thinking about.
so we have a segment to the podcast called Rocket Round.
Rocket round. All
We
good
have a
podcasts have a rocket
we have
round.
a range of questions. Short form answers are preferred, but I don't want to creatively hold you back. We didn't prep on this, so
This is like
anything.
this artist studio thing where you
I was
got
watching $100,000 Pyramid last night. You could pass on any of them. All right, we're gonna go here. This is a
I'm in.
good segment
Yeah,
here.
man.
All right. What's one word you'd use to describe your relationship with art?
Passion.
What was the first piece of art you ever sold?
Let me tell you about the first piece of art I ever bought, and then which is
Perfect.
always different than the first piece of art you ever sold. But the first piece of art I ever bought was a print. I went to Haverford College, and there was a print dealer that came in and sold me a Winslow Homer print, which I ended up realizing was not authentic. So the first piece I bought was a fake, but the first piece I sold was definitely real. So the first piece I sold probably was on that trip. I sold it to a trustee of the Met, who lived in this extraordinary apartment across the street from the Met. And it was one of those moments where my father gave me the contact, and I went with this Barutzi staff and to this incredible environment with Picassos and stuff. And there's nothing that I mean, it was such a dopamine hit to sell art too. It really, to get somebody to fit something. Sorry, this is a rocket round. No, go ahead. Let's go rocket
Now we're
round.
going spaceship.
My bad.
Spaceship.
The what?
You're going into a spaceship orbit. All good though. Favorite hidden gem in New York City?
I haven't seen it yet, but it's not hidden. But the Frick. Everyone's talking about the Frick. But hidden gem.
Doesn't have to be art.
No.
It's your hidden gem that you like, that you know about.
For me, one of the great additions to the city is Little Park, next to the Whitney Museum. What Adam Weinberg did, what Renzo Piano did, I'm a bike rider. I grew up on bicycles in New York City. The hidden gem is what's happened to the coastline of Manhattan Island. Because when I grew up, it was derelict, and now it's just one of the greatest resources for the city. So, and you can find hidden gems all along the coastline, multiple gems along the circumference.
The best advice you've ever received?
Patience.
A moment you knew you were doing the right work?
Never.
What's a book or film that changed your worldview?
Cool Hand Luke. The trouble you could get into by doing something benign or relatively harmless. And, I mean, I'm always on the edge of wondering when I'm going to be arrested.
Who's an artist that got away? Someone you wish you had worked with?
That I had worked with and I lost? An artist that I wish I'd worked with?
That you never got the chance to work with?
I mean, I don't know why she just comes to mind, but, someone like Louise Bourgeois, just I loved working with the artists I worked with, but there's some, I would maybe even go back historically. I mean, because I don't know much about that period, but I mean, if Raphael, some of the Renaissance. I mean, can you imagine being able to sort of work with? You don't kind of work. I just, let's go back to Louise Bourgeois for some reason.
Okay.
She was a badass woman and was way ahead of her time and is only getting better every time I look at her.
If you weren't in the art world, what do you think you'd be doing?
Running drugs, parallel fields. No, to answer that question truthfully, so that doesn't get back to haunt me. What I'm doing now is making films.
Okay.
I'm learning how to make films at the with the patronage of a handful of people, and film has always been a medium that I revere and have learned a lot from. So I'm trying to do what I wouldn't. That's what Saltmine Projects is, giving me multiple opportunities. I'm a classic amateur and a flaneur. Sort of, what a flaneur is? It's someone who kind of just wanders and observes and doesn't have much of a strategic I don't really think I'm a strategic businessman. I don't think I've ever had a game plan, which the art world welcomes, but also penalizes. The business world penalizes, the art world welcomes.
I got one final question.
Yeah.
What's one trend in the art world you're keeping an eye on?
It's been nice to see, as an ancient tribal art dealer, and complicated, for me to see sort of the emancipation and the kind of the proclamation and this sort of the language that the indigenous artists, contemporary indigenous artists, are using, American Indian in particular, African American community, outsider. I mean, I'm watching multiple trends, but I'm looking for. I think I'm always looking for trends that are a little bit more sotto voce, that don't feel sort of strategic, or don't feel, there's a lot of bad art. There's a lot of bad art out there now. And so maybe the trend that I'm looking for is somebody who is not processing massive amounts of information off the internet, synthesizing it, and then spewing it out. The trend that I'm looking for is what I haven't yet seen.
All right, well, that is going to be a finale
Is
on
that a
this
wrap?
conversation. Yeah, I
Good.
think you did a great job.
Did I? Appreciate that. I appreciate
Have you been on a podcast before?
Never. Yeah.
So
I've been asked a bunch of times, and
Thank you for doing
a couple
this.
people have asked me to sort of host them with him, art world driven stuff, but thus far I'm kind of like, the one trend that I'm not involved in is kind of social media. Social media is kind of a little bit of an anathema to my personal stability and existence. I
Thank you for being
stay
here
away from
today.
it. You were welcoming, and I appreciate the questions.
Thank you.
Hope that was interesting.